222, question number 2 on the worksheet. So this is continuing with our exploration into exceptions in Java. In the first video, I went over some of the basics of exceptions, how they are objects, kind of how they work, some of the syntax. And now we're going to put the second big part of exceptions together, which is the try-catch loop. If the exception itself is the kind of mechanism we use to throw errors, then the try-catch loop is the way we actually handle errors, right? So a lot of times you'll hear people refer to error handling, stuff like that, and it's often done with try-catch loops. So let's take a look at this question here. Basically, this is another what would Java display question. So all we're going to do is we're going to run through this method and we're going to print what we're going to print out at the end, what this string is that is being tracked by this test class. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about try-catch loops. And let's look at this one in particular right here, because this is a good one that really encapsulates everything. So if you look at this B method, notice first of all, this B method throws an exception, right? That means that whatever function is calling the B method has to call B in a try-catch loop. What function calls the B method? Well, it's the A method, and see right here, it's calling B and it's calling it within a try-catch loop. So this is all fine. This code would not compile if you did not have this try-catch loop right here. And again, referring to question 1 back up here, when I was saying, oh, okay, we need to put this feed in a try-catch loop. If it has this throws exception thing, this is where you would do it, right? You would basically just put a try here, put a catch here, et cetera, right? Okay, so that's how the function works. And this try-catch loop we see has 3 parts. It has a try, a catch, and a finally. So try basically just means try what is ever in this loop. So it's just going to run this code as normally. And if there are no errors, you know, nothing special is going to happen, right? Try doesn't do anything special. It's not like an if statement. It's not conditional. It just always happens. And if there are no errors in C, then nothing will happen. But let's say that there is an error in C. If there is an error in C, what's going to happen is we're going to move to this catch, right? This catch is going to catch the exception that C threw. Notice it says catch exception E. Notice that we are naming E with a variable because an exception, just like any other thing in Java, is an object. And then we're going to do something to it. In this case, we're just going to throw an exception. So for example, what might happen is we might try this first section, run this line. If this line errors, what's going to happen is we're going to immediately catch that error, and then we're just going to rethrow it in another place. But you could do something else, right? The reason you would want to do something like this is maybe when you try, you have to set up a bunch of structure, right? Maybe, for example, right, you see how in this try loop, we have a string, we're adding the letter D to the string. Maybe if there's an error, you don't want to add the letter D to the string. So in catch, what you might do is you might say something like, you know, string equals, you know, string minus D, basically, where you remove the D, right? It's a great way to say, hey, something errored and I need to undo something, let's undo it. Another thing about catches is catches are just like else if statements. You can have as many as you want. So remember, there are all different types of exceptions. This one is just the broad class exception from which all other exceptions extend. But before we had the invalid Pusheen exception. So you could have something where you say like, you know, try a line of code, and then you would catch, you know, like a Pusheen exception, which I'm just going to abbreviate PE. And then you have another catch where you catch, you know, a null pointer exception, and then you have another one where you do whatever, right? You can have as many catches as you want, and they can all do different things. They're just different ways to handle errors. Okay, the final part, no pun intended here, of this loop is this finally word. This is not something you see very often, but basically what it means is that after you run the try or the catch, either way, you're just going to run this at the end. It's just like a default thing you do at the end of the loop every single time. Why does it have to be within the loop? Well, we couldn't just have, you know, finally on its own. If we just tried to have this statement outside of the loop, consider what would happen. We would only ever run this in the case that the try completes, right? Because the second the try fails, we move on to the catch, and the catch throws another exception. But this way, we try, and if the try completes, we run the next line. If the catch completes, we still run the next line, right? Either way. That's the basic structure of how this all works. And now let's actually run this method. Okay, so basically we have this class called test. it just has a single string, which is A, and then it has a bunch of different methods in it. Some throw exceptions, some don't. And we're just going to start running the main method. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to create a new test object. This test doesn't have a constructor in it, so we're using the null constructor. So basically, we're going to have a single test object. It's called object, and it has a string in it, which I'm just going to keep track of here. It's just the string A, right? Next thing we're going to do is we're going to call object.a. So we're going to call this method. Okay, so we call this method. What happens? First thing that happens is we're going to run the try catch loop. So we're going to enter the try. We're going to add b to our string, right? So now we have ab is our string. And then we're going to run the b method. So we're going to pause execution here and go run b. So now we have b. We start running b. B also has a try. So we're going to start by running this try. This try is just going to add d to our string. So we do that, and then we're going to run c. We're going to pause execution of this b method and go run c. Now, c just throws an exception, right? Note that it also says throws exception. It doesn't have to say this. It could just throw the exception on its own if it wanted, but in this case it does. So c throws an exception. In other words, c errors. So remember what this try catch loop does. The try catch loop just completes as normal if everything works, if there's no error, but if there is an error, it's going to catch that error right here. So the exception thrown by C is going to be caught as E in the B method, right? What does that do? Well, it just throws another exception and it executes the finally, right? So we're going to throw this exception, but we're also going to execute this finally, because remember, we always execute the finally in the try catch loop, whether we pass the try or not. So E is going to get added to our string, and we are never going to run this F. Why are we not going to run it? Because we errored, right? And if we error, we're not going to make it to this line. So that's another way to kind of illustrate the difference between finally and something that is not in a finally loop. The finally is always going to run, whether we pass or fail. The just regular line here, string equal to self plus F, is not going to run if we fail. It would run if we did not error on C, but we did. Okay, anyway, so the B method is just going to end up throwing another exception, is all that's going to happen. Okay, so that's going to take us back up to the A method right here. And A is basically calling B, and it is going to catch the exception we just threw from C and then back to B. We're going to catch it up here, finally. And then what are we going to do? We're just going to add C to our string. So we're going to end up with a string like this, right? And then that's the end of it, because A returns void. That was the only method we called. So once we finish that try catch loop, we're done executing A. So this line right here is now done executing. Notice how the string has changed in here. And notice which letters we added to the string and which letters we didn't add. Then we just want to do object.display. All object.display does is it prints the string. So we're just going to print out A, B, D, E, C. Okay, and that is how this problem works. I hope this was helpful.